The thunder cracked like a whip across the Kansas sky, the first warning Pearl Van Houghton received before the downpour began. It was 1873, and she had exactly 23 minutes to make it back to her farm before the storm turned the dirt road into an impassable river of mud. Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickened her pace, the basket of supplies from town growing heavier with each step. She'd known better than to linger at the general store, but Mrs. Wilson's gossip about the new ranch hand at the Whitaker place had held her attention longer than she'd intended. Now dark clouds rolled across the horizon, swallowing the afternoon sun and casting the prairie in an eerie green light. The first fat drops of rain splashed against her cheeks as she hiked up her skirts and broke into a run. The wind picked up, tugging at her bonnet until it flew from her head, dangling by its ribbons around her neck. Pearl's auburn hair came loose from its pins, whipping around her face as the rain began to fall in earnest. She could see the crossroads ahead turn left, and it was still 3 miles to her farm. Too far to make it before the storm unleashed its full fury. The Wallace barn was closer, just a mile down the right fork. She could shelter there until the worst passed. Pearl veered right, but the ground had already begun to soften beneath her boots. Each step became more treacherous than the last as mud sucked at her heels. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in harsh white light, followed by a boom of thunder, so close it made her ears ring. Come on," she muttered, struggling forward as the rain came down in sheets now, so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Her dress, soaked through, clung to her legs and threatened to trip her with every stride. The sound of hoofbeats reached her ears, barely audible over the storm's roar. Pearl squinted through the curtain of rain to see a horse and rider approaching fast from the direction of the Wallace ranch. For a moment, fear clutched at her chest. Lone riders on stormy days could mean trouble for a woman alone, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized the broad shoulders and distinctive silhouette of Elijah Whitaker. "Miss Van Houghton," he called out, reining his horse alongside her. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in this?" Pearl had seen Elijah Whitaker at church socials and town meetings, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. At 28, he'd made quite a name for himself since arriving in Cottonwood Springs 2 years ago, turning a failing cattle operation into one of the most prosperous in the county. The women in town whispered about his handsome features and the mysterious past he never discussed, while the men respected his fair business dealings and skill with horses. "I got caught in town too long," she shouted over the storm. Trying to make it to the Wallace barn, lightning forked across the sky, startling Elijah's horse. He steadied the nervous animal with a gentle hand. "That barn leaks like a sieve. My place is closer. Let me take you there." Pearl hesitated. She lived alone on her farm since her father's passing last winter, and she guarded her reputation carefully. Accepting a ride to a bachelor's ranch during a storm might set tongues wagging. But the alternative was pneumonia, or worse. "I can make it on my own," she insisted, even as another gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Elijah shook his head, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Don't be foolish. This storm's turning nasty." He extended his hand. "Please, Miss Van Houghton." Another crash of thunder decided for her. Pearl grabbed his outstretched hand and let him pull her up behind him on the saddle. She clutched her basket with one hand and wrapped the other arm around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him even through his rain-soaked coat. "Hold tight," he called over his shoulder and urged his horse forward. They rode side by side with the storm, the powerful gelding sure-footed despite the deteriorating conditions. Pearl could feel Elijah's muscles tense beneath her arm as he guided the horse, keeping them on the safest path. She'd been on her own for so long, handling every crisis by herself, that the simple act of being helped felt strangely intimate. Almost there, Elijah shouted as his ranch house came into view, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide front porch and smoke curling from the chimney despite the summer season. A lamp burned in the window, a beacon in the gray deluge. As they approached the barn, a young boy of about 15 dashed out, head covered with a burlap sack against the rain. "Thomas," Elijah called. "Take care of Thunderbolt. Miss Van Houghton and I are heading to the house." The boy nodded and took the reins as Elijah dismounted, then turned to help Pearl down. Her legs trembled as her feet touched the ground, muscles stiff from tension and the awkward ride. "Careful now," Elijah said, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. "Let's get you inside and warmed up." They made a dash for the house, the rain pounding against them with renewed vigor. By the time they reached the porch, Pearl was gasping and laughing despite herself at the sheer absurdity of their situation. "I must look like a drowned rat," she said, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. Elijah smiled, and Pearl was struck by how it transformed his normally serious countenance. "A very dignified drowned rat," he replied, opening the door and ushering her inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her immediately, along with the scent of coffee and something savory cooking. A woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair twisted in a neat bun looked up from the stove, eyes widening at the sight of them. "Land's sakes, Mr. Whitaker. What have you dragged in with the storm?" "Mrs. Cooper, this is Miss Pearl Van Houghton. She was caught in the downpour on her way home from town." "Miss Van Houghton, my housekeeper, Mrs. Cooper." Pearl nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how her wet dress clung to her figure.
"Pleased to meet you, madam."
"I apologize for the intrusion." Mrs. Cooper waved away the apology. "Nonsense, child. We can't have you catching your death out there. Come along, let's find you some dry things to wear while those clothes of yours dry by the fire." Pearl followed the housekeeper upstairs to a small but comfortable bedroom. Mrs. Cooper rummaged through a trunk and produced a simple cotton dress. "This belonged to Mr. Whitaker's sister when she visited last spring. Should fit you well enough for now." Left alone, Pearl peeled off her sodden garments, dried herself with the towel Mrs. Cooper had provided, and slipped into the borrowed dress. It was a bit loose in the shoulders, but otherwise fit reasonably well. She did her best to tidy her damp hair, securing it with the few pins that had survived her wild run. When she returned downstairs, she found Elijah in dry clothes as well, standing by the fireplace. He turned at her entrance, and something flickered across his face: surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much, thank you. And thank you for the loan of the dress. Sarah wouldn't mind. She's in St. Louis now with her husband." He gestured to a chair at the table. "Mrs. Cooper insists you eat something warm before even thinking of heading back out." As if summoned, the housekeeper appeared with bowls of fragrant stew and thick slices of bread. "Eat up, both of you. That rain's not letting up anytime soon." Through the window, Pearl could see the storm raging unabated, sheets of water cascading from the eaves of the porch. She sighed, resigned to her situation. "I hope my chickens had the sense to take shelter." "They usually do," Elijah said, taking a seat across from her. "Animals are smarter about weather than people sometimes." "Is that a comment on my judgment today, Mr. Whitaker?" Pearl asked, raising an eyebrow. He smiled slightly. "I wouldn't presume to criticize, Miss Van Houghton. I've been caught out in my share of storms." As they ate, Pearl found conversation with Elijah surprisingly easy. He asked thoughtful questions about her farm, 20 acres left to her by her father, where she grew vegetables and kept chickens, and a small apple orchard. "It must be difficult managing it alone," he said. Pearl straightened her shoulders. "I manage well enough. I hire the Peterson boys for the heavy work when needed." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," Elijah said quickly. "I admire your determination. Many would have sold after your father's passing." "It's all I have left of him," Pearl said softly. "He came west with nothing and built that farm through sheer will. I can't let it go." Elijah nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My father was the same way about his land back in Virginia. Lost it all in the war, though." This was more than Pearl had ever heard about Elijah's past. The town knew he'd come from somewhere east, but details were scarce. "Is that why you came west?" A shadow crossed his face. "Partly. There wasn't much left for me there after Gettysburg. The war had ended 8 years ago, but Pearl knew its scars ran deep for many. Her own brother had never returned from a battlefield in Tennessee. "I lost my brother Matthew at Stone's River," she offered quietly. Elijah's eyes met hers, recognition of shared grief passing between them. "I'm sorry." They fell silent for a moment, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Mrs. Cooper bustled in to clear their empty bowls. "That rain's settling in for the duration, Miss Van Houghton. I've made up the guest room for you. No sense in trying to make it home tonight." Pearl's eyes widened. "Oh, but I couldn't. You absolutely can and will," the housekeeper said firmly. "Mr. Whitaker and Thomas will see to your farm in the morning if need be, but I won't have you risking pneumonia or worse trying to get back in this downpour." Pearl looked to Elijah, who nodded. "Mrs. Cooper is right. The creek between here and your place will be over its banks by now. It wouldn't be safe." Recognizing the practicality of their argument, Pearl acquiesced. "You're both very kind. Thank you." After dinner, Elijah showed Pearl to his small library. "I thought you might like something to occupy your time. The storm doesn't look to be letting up anytime soon." Pearl ran her fingers along the spines of books that filled the shelves from floor to ceiling. "This is impressive. I wouldn't have expected a simple cattle rancher to have such a collection." Elijah finished, amusement in his voice. Pearl blushed. "I didn't mean it's all right. Most people see the hat and boots and make assumptions." He pulled a volume from the shelf. "This might interest you. It's about agricultural innovations in fruit cultivation." Pearl took the book, their fingers brushing momentarily. "You remembered about my orchard." "I pay attention," he said simply. They settled into comfortable chairs as the storm continued its assault outside. Pearl became absorbed in the book, occasionally asking Elijah questions about techniques mentioned that she might apply to her own small orchard. His responses revealed a depth of knowledge that surprised her. "How do you know so much about apple trees?" she finally asked. Elijah's expression softened with memory. "My grandfather had an orchard in the Shenandoah Valley. I spent summers there as a boy, learning to graft and prune alongside him." "You miss it," Pearl observed, not a question but a recognition. "Every day," he admitted. "But that world doesn't exist anymore." Before Pearl could respond, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by a splintering crash from outside. They both jumped to their feet. "That sounded like," Pearl began. "The old oak," Elijah confirmed, grabbing a lantern from the side table. "I need to check that it hasn't damaged the barn." "I'll come with you," Pearl said, already following him to the door. Elijah hesitated. "It's still pouring out there." "And I've already been soaked once today," she countered. "A little more rain won't hurt me." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. He nodded and handed her a slicker from a hook by the door. "Stay close." They dashed through the downpour to the barn, where Thomas was already assessing the damage. The massive oak that had stood near the corner of the structure had split nearly in half, one enormous branch crashing onto the barn roof. "It's punched a hole through, sir," Thomas reported, pointing to where rain was already streaming into the hayloft. "Horses are spooked but not hurt." "We need to cover that hole before the hay gets soaked," Elijah said, already moving toward the ladder to the loft. For the next hour, Pearl worked alongside Elijah and Thomas, holding lanterns, passing tools, and helping to position a tarpaulin over the damaged section of roof. The work was wet and difficult, but Pearl's practical farm experience proved valuable. By the time they finished, all three were exhausted, but satisfied with their temporary repair. Back in the house, Mrs. Cooper fussed over them, insisting they change into dry clothes again, and serving hot coffee laced with something stronger that Pearl suspected came from a bottle Elijah kept for medicinal purposes. "You've got a good hand with emergency repairs, Miss Van Houghton," Elijah said as they warmed themselves by the fire. "When you run a farm alone, you learn to handle whatever comes," she replied. "And please, after sharing roofing duties in a thunderstorm, I think you might call me Pearl." He smiled, the firelight catching the gold flecks in his brown eyes.
Pearl, then.
"And I'm Elijah to my friends." "Are we friends now?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "I'd like to think so," he replied quietly. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of connection beyond the circumstantial meeting the storm had forced upon them. Pearl felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the whiskey-laced coffee. The storm continued through the night, its fury gradually diminishing to a steady rainfall by morning. Pearl woke to sunlight filtering through unfamiliar curtains and the distant sounds of a working ranch coming to life. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry and pressed thanks to Mrs. Cooper's attentions, and made her way downstairs. Elijah was already at the breakfast table, studying what appeared to be a ledger. He looked up at her approach, and the smile that spread across his face sent an unexpected flutter through Pearl's chest. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well despite the storm." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "But I should get back to my farm as soon as possible. My animals will need tending." "Thomas rode over at first light to check on things," Elijah said. "Your chickens and cow are fine, though he said there's a large branch down on your fence. I thought we might ride over together after breakfast, and I could help you repair it." Pearl was touched by the thoughtfulness. "That's very kind, but I don't want to take up more of your time." "It's no trouble. Neighborly duty. Is that all it is?" The question slipped out before Pearl could stop it. Elijah's gaze held hers steadily. "No," he said simply. "Not all." The ride to Pearl's farm took them across land washed clean by the storm, puddles reflecting the blue sky where yesterday there had been only dust. The creek had indeed overflowed its banks as Elijah had predicted, but was now receding. "You were right about the creek," Pearl acknowledged. "I wouldn't have made it across yesterday." "Sometimes the sensible choice is the hardest to make," Elijah said. "Asking for help doesn't come easily to independent souls." Pearl glanced at him. "You sound like you understand that struggle personally." "Takes one to know one," he replied with a wry smile. At the farm, Pearl was relieved to find the damage minimal, the fallen branch on the fence, some shingles torn from the chicken coop, and her garden looking a bit battered, but salvageable. Elijah set to work on the fence immediately, declining Pearl's offer to handle it herself with good-natured persistence. As they worked side by side throughout the morning, Pearl found herself sharing stories of her childhood on the farm, her father's dreams for the orchard, and her own hopes to expand it someday. Elijah, in turn, spoke more of his life in Virginia, his time in the Union Army, and his journey west seeking a fresh start after losing everything in the war. "Why cattle?" Pearl asked as they paused for water. "With your knowledge of orchards, I would have thought." Elijah shrugged. "Cattle seemed simpler."
Laisse permanent ce mot.
"An orchard." He trailed off, looking toward the neat rows of apple trees Pearl's father had planted. "An orchard is a commitment to the future, to staying in one place. I wasn't ready for that when I came west. And now?" Pearl asked softly. His eyes met hers. "Now I'm beginning to see the appeal." The days following the storm brought changes to Pearl's routine. Elijah began finding reasons to ride by her farm, delivering a tool she might find useful for her orchard, bringing news from town, offering assistance with repairs she'd been putting off. Each visit lingered longer than the last, their conversations deepening, the attraction between them growing more difficult to ignore. A month after the storm, Pearl attended the town's Founders' Day celebration, where she found herself watching Elijah across the crowded town square. He stood talking with several other ranchers, but his eyes kept finding their way to her. When the music started for dancing, he made his way directly to her side. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked, extending his hand. As they joined the other couples, Pearl was acutely aware of the glances and whispers their pairing had generated among the townspeople. Elijah Whitaker had never shown particular interest in any of the eligible women in Cottonwood Springs before. "People are talking," she murmured as he guided her through the steps of the dance. "Let them," he replied, his hand warm against her back. "Unless you mind?" Pearl shook her head. "I find I don't care as much as I thought I would." His smile was worth all the gossip in Kansas. "Good." Later that evening, as Elijah walked Pearl to her wagon, they paused in the shadow of the mercantile, momentarily hidden from curious eyes. "Pearl," Elijah said, his voice low and serious. "These past weeks since the storm, they've been the happiest I've known since before the war." Pearl's heart quickened. "For me as well." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I came west thinking I'd leave the past behind, never put down roots again. But meeting you has changed everything." "Elijah, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not a man who speaks easily of feelings, but I need you to know that I care for you deeply. More than I thought possible." Pearl felt tears prick her eyes. "I care for you too." His free hand came up to touch her cheek. "May I call on you properly?" With intentions that the whole town can speculate about to their heart's content. Pearl laughed softly, covering his hand with her own.
"Yes.
I'd like that very much." In the weeks that followed, Elijah became a regular visitor at the Van Houghton farm. Together they worked on projects Pearl had long deferred, expanding the chicken coop, reinforcing the barn roof, planting new rows for the orchard. Their partnership felt natural, as though they'd been working side by side for years instead of months. One warm October afternoon, they sat in the shade of Pearl's apple trees, baskets of the season's harvest surrounding them. Elijah had been uncharacteristically quiet, and Pearl sensed something weighing on his mind. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, setting aside the apple she'd been polishing. Elijah looked up from the grafting knife he'd been absently turning in his hands. "I've been offered a deal to supply cattle to the railroad. It would mean expanding my operations significantly." "That's wonderful news," Pearl said, though she noticed he didn't seem entirely pleased. "It would require more land," he continued, "and more of my time." Pearl nodded, understanding his concern. "But it's a good opportunity, isn't it?" "It is. But—" He set the knife down and took her hands in his. "Pearl, I don't want anything to come between us. This relationship we've built means everything to me. A business opportunity won't change how I feel about you," she assured him. "What if?" Elijah took a deep breath. "What if we combined our operations? Your farm and my ranch. Your orchard knowledge and my cattle experience." Pearl's eyes widened. "Elijah, are you proposing a business arrangement?" A smile tugged at his mouth. "Not exactly." He shifted to kneel before her, still holding her hands. "Pearl Van Houghton, I love you. I've loved you since I watched you running through that storm, refusing to give up even when the odds were against you. I love your strength, your determination, your gentle heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Joy burst like sunshine through Pearl's heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Elijah Whitaker, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, his kiss tasting of apples and promise. When they finally parted, Pearl laughed, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "What is it?" Elijah asked, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I was just thinking," Pearl said, "that I should be grateful for that storm." "As am I," Elijah agreed, pressing his forehead to hers. "Though I suspect we would have found our way to each other eventually." "Perhaps," Pearl conceded. "But I like our story. The headstrong woman running through the rain, and the cowboy who wouldn't let her face the storm alone. Who knew that riding through one storm would lead us here? Elijah mused, pulling her close again. To the beginning of many adventures together, Pearl said softly. They were married in the spring of 1874, beneath the blossoming apple trees on what was now their combined property. The town turned out in full force, Mrs. Cooper crying happy tears as she straightened Elijah's tie, and Mrs. Wilson proudly claiming she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. Under their joint care, both the orchard and the cattle ranch flourished. Pearl introduced new apple varieties that became sought after throughout the county, while Elijah's contracts with the railroad brought prosperity that allowed them to employ several local families and expand their operations. When their first child was born a year after their wedding, a daughter with Elijah's thoughtful brown eyes and Pearl's determined spirit, they named her April, for the month of renewal and promise. She'll grow up knowing both orchards and open range, Pearl said as they stood together by the cradle, watching their daughter sleep. The best of both our worlds, Elijah agreed. Just as we've created together. 5 years after the storm that brought them together, Pearl and Elijah stood on the porch of their expanded farmhouse, watching another summer thunderstorm roll across the prairie. Their daughter played safely inside with her 2-year-old brother, while outside, the rain nourished the expanded orchard and watered the grazing lands where Elijah's cattle grew fat and content. Remember that day? Elijah asked, his arm around Pearl's waist as they watched lightning dance across the horizon. How could I forget? Pearl leaned her head against his shoulder. I was so determined to outrun that storm. And I was so determined not to let you try it alone. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Best decision I ever made, riding beside you that day. Pearl turned in his arms to face him. Even though we got soaked to the skin? Especially because of that, he murmured, bending to kiss her properly. It washed away all my excuses for keeping to myself and showed me what really mattered. As the rain fell around their sheltered porch, nourishing the land they tended together, Pearl silently thanked that long-ago storm for bringing her not just through the rain, but to the love that had transformed her life. The woman who had once tried to outrun the elements had found, in surrendering to nature's power, the greatest strength of all, a love that would weather any storm.